Welcome, everybody. My name is Sarah Gomez. I'm the Assistant Director of the Environmental Studies Program at Tufts University. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Hope Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series. I'm really excited to see how many of you are not from Massachusetts. We have people from all over the country today, so welcome everybody. The Hope Cunningham Environmental Lectures are made possible thanks to the generosity of Tufts alumni Daphne Hope Cunningham and Roland Hoke. And if you want to know more about the exciting roster we have for this fall, I encourage you to visit our website. Here we'll put a link in the chat. Okay. And also, if you want to receive alerts about these talks every week, or if you are a student and want to receive internship opportunities, you can sign up for either of those newsletters in this other link. And I hope to see you there. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items. The chat will be deactivated, but if you do have a question, you are welcome to post it either in the Q&A section, or you are also going to be able to raise your hand at the end of the lecture, and we'll allow you to use your voice if you prefer to do that way. And finally, I wanted to add that this meeting is being recorded, so it will be available in our website as well. And if you need it before that, probably it will be there in the next few days or week or so. But if you need it before that, feel free to send us an email and I can send you the link directly. All right, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Tania Taranovski and Jessika Brenin. Jessika is a graduate student at Tufts University in the dual degree program of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning and Food and Nutrition Policy at the Freedman School, where she focuses on equitable food systems planning. During her time at Tufts, she has collaborated on projects with many stakeholders, including the City of Medford, the Livable Streets Alliance, and the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And most recently, she has worked with Farm to Institution New England, also known as FINE, to explore how regional food procurement on college campuses relates to student food access and food justice, which she will be presenting on today. Our second speaker, or co-speaker, is Tania Taranovski. She also has a Tufts connection. She is a Jambo. She graduated from Tufts in 1993 with a degree in environmental studies and biology, and is currently the director of programs at FINE. Before that, she worked at the New England Aquarium, Earthwatch Institute, and also as an independent consultant. And over the last couple of decades, she has developed market-based approaches to seafood sustainability. She has supported community-based research to address human-wildlife conflict in Africa, and she's currently focusing on how regional food and food systems can evolve to address ecological and social problems. Today, they will be presenting a project that they've been working on together, and I'm really excited to hear more about it. So Tania, Jessika, thank you for being here today, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. And I also want to thank the Environmental Studies program for organizing these lectures. They're really great. And also for inviting us to share our work with you today. I'm really appreciating the opportunity to connect with the Tufts community in this way. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a Tufts grad, and so I'd also like to say thanks to Tufts because it's helped launch me into the environmental work that I've done over the course of my career. On the off chance he's listening or is going to pay attention to this lecture at some point, I want to do a special shout out for Professor Jan Pechenik. He was one of my very favorite and most influential professors at Tufts University while I was there. So thanks, Dr. Pechenik. I want to also thank all of you for joining us today to talk about the Farm to College movement, what it is and how it's evolving. Give me a moment here. I'm making sure that my slides are moving. There we go. We're also going to, as Sarah said, we're specifically delving into the relationship between farm to college efforts and student food access and justice. I'm really thrilled to be co-presenting with Jessika Brenin today. Jessika has recently collaborated with FINE, and she's going to be sharing the results of that research today. We'd also both like to invite you all to reach out to us at any time to ask questions, offer suggestions for our work, and just to connect. So I just want to sort of briefly go over what you can expect from this conversation today, this lecture. We're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to start and talk a little bit about Farm to Institution New England and the Farm and Sea to Campus network. Then delve into what Farm to Institution and Farm to College really are, how we look at that. Talk a little bit about what Farm to College looks like at Tufts, and touch on what we see as impacts from the pandemic on Farm to College. And then, as I said, Jessika is going to take the reins, and she's going to speak about her work looking at the intersection of farm to college with food justice and access. Then we'd like to wrap things up with a conversation about intersectionality of this and movement building, and answer any questions that you may have. So please feel free to pepper us with any questions that you may have. And there's a lot that we're going to try to cover, but there's also a lot more of it we might not have time for, and we welcome any questions or follow-up afterwards as well. So, that Farm to Institution New England, or FINE as we call ourselves, is a network organization. We were founded about 10 years ago, and it was born out of a growing farm to school effort and a desire to connect those different state-led efforts across the region. Our mission is simply to mobilize the power of New England institutions to transform our food system. And our vision describes the transformation that we're seeking for that regional food system. Our goal is to build equity and justice into that food system, and to ensure that healthy food that is truly nourishing the people of the region also is nourishing and sustaining our environment. And while people often think of terrestrial agriculture, and this image I've chosen definitely continues to highlight that, our work and vision very much includes oceans and waterways as part of the food system. Seafood is integral to all of this. And obviously, from my background, you know that that's a passion of mine. So happy to answer questions about that down the road too. In terms of what FINE actually does, we are primarily a network organization. We are bringing together food system stakeholders to connect them with each other, to provide them with resources, information, ideas, to advance this vision for change. We organize events, we coordinate communities of practice, and we also seek to evaluate the progress of our activities and the activities of those in our network through research and metrics, and you'll be sharing an example of that today. We are also significantly involved in certain program areas, including the coordination and support of a college network called the Farm and Sea to Campus Network, which I've highlighted here under programs. The Farm and Sea to Campus Network, or network within a network, seeks to support those who are working on farm to college efforts. There was not an existing network until about 2015, when FINE worked with a number of stakeholders to gather and form this formal campus network. It includes dining directors, chefs, sustainability managers, college administrators, food service workers, producers, and supply chain actors. We're helping to coordinate the leadership and activities of this network through a steering committee, different working groups and projects, and we also are finding ways to use FINE's communication tools to engage people in our campus-related efforts. So what exactly is Farm to Institution and Farm to College? Well, this is the formal definition. It's the infrastructure, processes, supply chain relationships, and policies that enable food to travel from producers to institutional consumers within the region. But fundamentally, in essence, it's about all aspects of bringing food from the farm to an institution and all the different supply chain steps along the way. And that's within a defined region, which for us is the states of New England. It includes the full supply chain. It includes also policies, both institutional and governmental, that are affecting those supply chains. But fundamentally, it revolves around the values of institutions as potential levers of change. So when I talk about how we work with institutions, the reason for that is that, of course, this is pre-pandemic, but institutions really represent a diversified and generally, pre-COVID, stable market for farmers and supply chain actors. Pre-COVID, on average, New England institutions were spending about 17% of their food budgets on local food. They also have about $1 billion spend annually on food and beverage, so 17% is not a bad number. They serve as anchors in our community, engaging in community in a number of different ways, and also because they are able to reach 3.7 million students, employees, and patients every day. It's a great opportunity to think about their reach in terms of food decisions being made by people throughout New England. FINE is working with 4 specific institutional sectors. So when we talk about institutions, these are really the ones that we're focused on. As I've mentioned, we do a lot of work with colleges and universities, and that's going to be the focus of the information that I provide next. We also work with K through 12 schools, with hospitals and healthcare systems, and the newest sector that we started working with is jails and correctional facilities. We don't have a lot of data yet for what their local food procurement looks like, but it is something that they're doing, and that's information that we're eager to collect and learn more about and connect stakeholders with. The data that I'm going to provide, again, is focused on colleges, but I'm going to share a little bit about what's happening in other sectors just for some comparison. Oops, sorry. The average percent of an institutional food budget that's spent on local food amongst New England colleges and universities is at 21.5%. And for schools, that is at 16%. Hospitals and healthcare systems are spending about 15% of their budgets on local food. And as I mentioned, we don't know yet for corrections. In terms of dollar amounts, that translates to about 68 million at the college level, 25 million around with K through 12 schools, 42 million with hospitals. This information is based on a number of surveys, and the hospital data, because of the small sample size, this number is actually extrapolated from the answers that were received. The 68 million represented here by colleges is the directly taken from respondents to our survey. And this is data that was taken from our 2017 and 2018 survey. But if we actually extrapolate and learn, we tried to do a little bit of work with our non-respondents to learn more about this, we actually think that the real number spent on local food is over 100 million per year if you factor in all colleges and universities in New England and what they're doing. With respect to farm to college in New England, there are 200 colleges in New England with dining services, and our goal is to try to reach all of them in some way or another. There are also over 32,000 farms in New England. Many of them are smaller farms. This image here is of a label that was provided at a dining hall to highlight local food that is on their menu. And these were peppers from the Taranovski farm out in Western Mass. Taranovski farm is actually one of the larger farms that supplies to institutional markets. And they're even able to aggregate some produce from other farmers, smaller farmers, that might not be able to access institutional markets on their own. There are, as I've just mentioned, a lot of barriers to selling food to institutions. This data comes from a survey that FINE did with producers back in 2016. And we also wanted to compare the kind of responses that producers who sell to institutions were giving us about barriers, as well as those producers that are not selling to institutions. So the dark green bar on the top of each of these represents producers who are not currently or were not currently selling to institutions. And the lighter green bar represents producers, responses from producers that were selling to institutions. And interestingly, amongst these top barriers that the producers highlighted, there was a statistical difference in the perceptions of producers who were not selling to institutions compared to those who were. So for example, the first barrier mentioned, and one of the highest mentioned responses, was low purchase price, that institutions simply don't pay enough per product to make it worthwhile. And this was definitely something that 78% of the producers who answered our survey identified as an issue if they weren't already selling to institutions. Those who were, only 41% identified the low purchase price. So there's other factors involved that make it work for a farm or not. And it's important to understand and unpack some of that, which FINE is trying to work on. Volume needs is another key barrier. Seasonality of products is mentioned, although there's no difference there between perceptions of producers that sell or don't sell to institutions. Food safety requirements, there are a lot of requirements in place, and sometimes those are very confusing and expensive and hard to navigate for small farmers. And just generally the institutional interest in the products, whether that be in the form of the actual product or the form that it takes. Some institutions are looking for processed food, so it's something to consider. So this is part of the reason why the percent spend is actually not higher. There are a lot of barriers in terms of getting more local food to institutions. I want to highlight that the data that I've been giving is really all based on where the food is coming from. And there is this idea of local food is really at the heart of the farm to institution and farm to college movements. There's an assumption that local serves as a proxy for other values, that local food is going to be more nutritious because it reaches the consumer more quickly, that it's going to have less impact on the environment if there's lower miles involved in transport, and as well as other things. But although there's some evidence that some of this is true, it's not always true. And so the movement is really growing to recognize the importance of these other values and the need to focus in on them explicitly. We also are seeing an evolving sort of sense of what the mechanisms of change are. Procurement continues to be key, money talks, but the education of the people who are at the institutions or involved in the institutions is also a really significant lever for change. And the engagement within and beyond the campus boundaries is also really significant, and the role that institutions can play with their broader communities. Institutional commitments are driven by many factors, but there's a few organizations that are helping set standards and help set targets for institutions. In the college and university side of things, Real Food Challenge is one of the organizations that is working to set standards for what procurement could look like, as well as help colleges set goals. Real Food Challenge is very much focused on the engagement and activism of students and their work directly with dining services at colleges. This slide comes from the 2017-2018, which is the most recent impact report from the Real Food Challenge. And this graph is really highlighting the percentage spend on products with these different values associated with them. So the local and community-based is there in orange. Environmentally sound is represented in green. Fair, which represents sort of what entails how workers are paid, how they're treated. This is in blue. And then humane, which is about how the animals involved are treated. You can see that local continues to be a high focus, and we see that trend as well. FINE is also involved in this work. FINE has worked in consultation with stakeholders to define what regional food is, as well as help set a target for what we hope institutions will achieve. And currently, we're hoping that by 2030, New England institutions are going to spend 30% of their food budget on regionally grown, raised, harvested, or manufactured food. It's a pretty big ask to get from, for colleges from 20 to 30, and we know that schools and hospitals are even lower. So this is a big ask. We define regionally produced food as food that is grown, raised, or harvested within the 6 New England states, give or take 50 miles, and also includes processed or manufactured foods where at least 50% of the ingredients were regionally grown. This doesn't include Coke from local producers or a tomato sauce where only the garlic is regionally grown. So that just helps define what that is. All of this data comes from a number of surveys, including, I've mentioned this now already, the FINE College Dining Survey. We're planning our next college dining survey for next year, which we hope is going to start to include some of the impacts from the pandemic and what that has meant for dining services. So that should be interesting. If you want to dig into this more or learn more about some of the metrics we offer, we have an online dashboard where you can find out a lot more. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. I also want to touch on, of course, what is happening at Tufts. And this is information from Patty Kloss, who is the lead on dining services here at Tufts. Tufts currently has a goal of, or their goal has been to reach 20% spend by 2020. And their local definition is to source product within 250 miles of main campus. And I'm really pleased to announce, which I think might be the first public announcement, Patty can confirm that perhaps, that Tufts has reached 23% of their budget spend over the last year, which is actually really impressive when you consider the fact that this was also the year that dining was more or less closed for many months and supply chains were extremely disrupted. So this is great, and I'm really proud of the work that Tufts has been doing on this, and I hope you are too. There's some really wonderful stories also to be shared about the kind of work that goes into this. For example, Patty was able to find a local supplier from Jamaica Plain to provide organic whole wheat flour for the pizza dough. So if you've been eating pizza in the dining halls over the last year, you can know that it was locally sourced flour that made that crust and that it was organic and healthy as well. There's also a lot of work that Tufts has been doing to think about cultural relevance and to do some menu design, inclusive menu design, particularly for things like events. So if there's an event that has a particular theme or is reaching a particular audience and there are ideas about what the menu should look like, they've worked with those stakeholders and customers to try to develop a culturally relevant menu. So congratulations to Tufts for what you're doing, and excited to hear more about where you go next. And hopefully FIND can be there to support all that effort as well. So one of the last things I want to touch on is the impacts from COVID-19. And you all know, you've all seen on your own campus that dining operations have been greatly reduced. That has meant some serious financial losses, and that's pretty significant because dining services across the board are seen as a revenue generation or a revenue option for colleges. That's also led to decreased employment. On the flip side, also, FIND has been collecting stories from New England colleges about how they're responding to the pandemic. We know that there are a lot of colleges who have worked very hard to retain their dining staff and to think about ways to redeploy them. We also know that the pandemic has meant greater food insecurity, and food banks around the region are starting to step up to help meet that need. And we know that that's going to have impacts on campuses going forward. For students, for staff and faculty even, this is an issue that touches everybody. And also that we know that there are much greater racial inequities that are that are very much uncovered and highlighted by this, and something that needs to be recognized and dealt with. But there are a lot of opportunities and innovations that we see happening too. When supply chains were really disrupted, local suppliers stepped in to help meet demand. And that has led to some new and stronger partnerships. And one of the things that we're hoping is that the reduced volume that colleges have right now might lead to opportunities for smaller farmers to develop relationships and to learn how to deal with the institutional market and their needs, so that as demand scales up again in the future, that they'll be ready for that. So this is a great opportunity that I really encourage people to think about. And we see folks on campuses getting very creative too. As I mentioned, Tufts has stepped up in a number of ways, not even just food related, but also we've seen things like lab supplies being donated for medical purposes, and unused dorm space being considered for overflow at hospitals or quarantining. This is something that Tufts has done an amazing job of trying to think about how they can serve their community. And again, as a Tufts grad, I'm really proud to see all that hard work and impressed with what's been going on. Finally, I just want to share a little bit with some information that helped lead FIND to work with Tufts and our next speaker, Jessika Brenin. In our last campus dining survey, we wanted to learn more about the connection between food access and farm to college efforts, especially as we were learning about the growing concerns of food insecurity on campus and among students. So we added some questions about campus food pantries and campus farms. And through that, we learned that only about a third of our survey respondents had a food pantry on campus. Of those that did, about half were already working in connection with dining services, but the other half were not. And that's an interesting place to explore, I think. We also asked about, as I said, campus farms, and a higher number of colleges that participated in our survey, 45%, did say that they had a campus farm or growing space, and that of those who had that kind of growing space, 63% were using some or all of the product in their dining services. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Jessika to really take the conversation forward about how all of this is translating into campus and food justice concerns and issues. So Jessika, over to you.
Thank you, Tania. Let me pull up the presentation. Apologies, one more minute. Huh. Third time's the charm. Tania, could I get a verbal confirmation? Is the presentation up and running?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tania. And hi, everyone. My name is Jessika. I am a dual degree graduate student at Tufts studying urban planning and food policy. And earlier this year, I conducted research with FINE looking at farm to college, student food access, and food justice in New England. First, I'll introduce the research initiative. I'll share some of our findings on emerging COVID-19 impacts for campus food systems and student food access. Then I'll jump into showing the strongest relationships that emerged connecting farm to college with student food access and food justice. And I'll wrap up by sharing how farm to college showed up in this research as one strategy to build an intersectional food movement. Farm to college, Tania defined earlier. This research mostly focuses on the regional food procurement piece of farm to college. We focus on the New England region as the defined boundary of regional food. And as we see regional food procurement becoming increasingly popular on college campuses, we also see an increasing need to assess its full range of impacts on the campus food system. College students are the largest stakeholder group within campus food systems. Recent interest in college student food access has grown, and studies report that college students may experience really high rates of food insecurity. Factors with potential to influence student food access, such as regional food procurement initiatives on campus, are ready and ripe for critical analysis. Our exploratory research begins this work of digging into the practice of regional food procurement as it relates to student food access and food justice on college campuses. As mentioned before, we focus on New England because it is where I am studying and the food system that we find ourselves in. Also, the research collaboration with FINE provided unique data and network access to stakeholders in the New England region working in this area. And finally, I'll share that the methods for this research initiative were a systematic literature review and interviews with 14 stakeholders holding a wide variety of roles in New England college campus food systems. Throughout the analysis, I use a food justice approach to illuminate inequities attributable to race and wealth. Because the interviews were conducted in April and May of this year, we started by acknowledging how stakeholders may have experienced great changes in their work due to COVID-19. This turned out to be true for everyone we spoke with. Overall, interviewees reported that students were experiencing decreased food access in ways that raise food justice concerns. One college had surveyed their students on COVID-19 impacts. As can be predicted, they found worsened student food access as students lost employment and moved off campus. And this was particularly apparent for low-income students relying on jobs and campus aid programs to access food. One stakeholder shared with the survey initiative, due to COVID, self-identified food insecurity did show up higher than what we consider our baseline rates, which was 1 in 5 students. Another stakeholder shared that college students are in a really tough position. They can't work for the most part. Work-study programs for low-income students are no longer viable. And another stakeholder shared, we have a Swipe Out Hunger program on campus, an emergency food fund that provides up to 14 meals. It's a safety net for students. We did have to unfortunately stop that program. We also have food pantries on campus that decided to close their doors because of the risk of transmitting COVID. We also heard about an additional barrier that comes from the loss of work opportunities for students, which is the potential loss of SNAP benefits at a time when students participating in the SNAP Federal Nutrition Assistance Program most need help affording food. These hardships experienced by students without external financial means are food justice issues. We also saw that colleges were responding to the food access needs both on and off campus. Multiple colleges were facilitating food access initiatives for their off-campus students in the surrounding community and for students who were still on campus because they couldn't move off due to travel restrictions. From one stakeholder, we learned that their student food insecurity working group is doing an off-campus delivery of free grocery items and grocery gift cards. We also heard about another college using its campus food service to support community food access. They shared the college is providing 153 meals a day to homeless people who are housed in hotels around town. So we are continuing with the amount of food that dining services is preparing, of which 50% is regionally sourced. Both of these examples show how colleges are meeting immediate food needs of students and community members. And while it is more of a Band-Aid solution, instead of looking at the root causes of food systems inequities, we are seeing how colleges are using their resources to provide food and regional food, in some cases, for people who face barriers accessing regional food due to wealth and race dynamics, especially with the second example. In addition to asking about COVID-19, we provided our interviewees with a series of 10 prompts that got them thinking about how regional food procurement might be related to student food access and food justice on campus. And one of the main indicators that came forward was this concept of differential access. To prompt responses to this question, we asked stakeholders, how does access to regionally procured food change for students of different race, income level, or ethnicity on campus? And while responses discussed differential access to regional food for students on the basis of wealth and of ethnicity, race was completely absent from any of our discussions. So we don't have any findings to share on that. It's just an interesting point to note. First, we heard that regional food on campus was more expensive for some students, but not for others. Most stakeholders explained how costs were managed within overall campus food budgets and were therefore not passed along to students. One of the dining directors explained, in our dining program, a student who comes from a different culture, race, or income level would not see a difference in our meal plan options because they are all the same price and students get to choose whichever foods they want in the dining halls. However, multiple examples of differential access did appear, especially for regional food. Almost all stakeholders acknowledged that regional food options in retail and a la carte food environments were more expensive for student purchase some of the time. To share the words of one stakeholder, we recognize that regional food comes with a premium most of the time. Students do see, in some cases, a higher cost for regional products. At the end of the day, some students just don't have that capability, especially if they're facing food insecurity. This was true for across multiple campuses, which suggests that in general, the cost premiums that exist for students without meal plans are not apparent for students with meal plans. These two quotes show that distinction. So if students are choosing not to buy meal plans due to financial restrictions, then this difference does become a food justice issue. We're also surprised to hear that regional food was less available on some campuses altogether than other campuses. One stakeholder who worked as a statewide food service coordinator explained to us that we have one school that is in a demographically lower income area, and we had to adjust our menu up there to be lower cost items. We weren't able to sell as much of the locally procured higher cost items, or we had to adapt them. So for example, on most of our campuses, we sell a 5.3 ounce regional burger. And on that campus, we dropped it down to a 3.2 or a 4 ounce regional burger because it made it a better price point for those folks to be able to purchase it. This example shows how some colleges may offer fewer regional food options, and when they do offer them, smaller regional food options for students, and how a college with less collective student wealth may expose students to differential access to regional food en masse. The strong relationship between the regional nature of food and the higher prices, whether that is passed along to students or not, demonstrate a food justice concern in which lower income students and lower income colleges have less access to regionally procured foods. In addition to finding evidence of differential access, we also heard that campus agriculture projects were a key mechanism connecting regional food procurement with student food access. Campus agriculture projects took the form of research farms, education and production farms, or community gardens on campus. These pictures show what campus agriculture projects at New England colleges can look like. Some of the images come from colleges represented in the research. Most stakeholders explained that some of the food produced through campus agriculture projects were typically sold or donated to campus dining. And because campus agriculture projects are growing food within the region, this counts as a factor of regional food procurement. In this way, campus agriculture projects increased student food access by literally providing regionally grown food that students oftentimes liked to eat. Some projects provided significant amounts of food, like this one example, who shared, last year, the campus farm supplied about 26,000 pounds of food to the dining hall. Stakeholders also focused on students' engagement in campus agriculture projects and how they liked to eat food grown from them. One stakeholder shared, when the dining hall is serving vegetables from our own farm, students participate in growing that food, so it's always popular. Another, perhaps more surprising relationship that we found was that campus agriculture projects may be used to increase the cultural relevance of food on campus. We defined student food access as the availability and affordability of nutritious and personally acceptable food on college campuses. The cultural relevance of food is an important aspect of food acceptability, and therefore cultural relevance is a factor of student food access. We saw the cultural relevance of campus food being increased through campus agriculture projects in a variety of ways. A few stakeholders mentioned how dining services sometimes requested culturally relevant crops to be grown on campus ag projects. One shared, we have a greenhouse on campus that we operate, and the chefs collaborate with the farmers on what they're going to grow. One of our chefs has them grow tomatillos and Mexican herbs and a specific kind of Korean pepper, so we can better provide what students are asking for. We also saw campus agriculture projects being used as a tool to partner with off-campus groups to increase the cultural relevance of food. In this example, the stakeholder shared, our farm has just started up an Abenaki garden in partnership with a local Abenaki chief and tribe. And so they are trying to raise awareness of Abenaki foods and Abenaki gardening methods on campus. When campus agriculture projects are used intentionally in this way to produce culturally relevant food and to produce culturally relevant food in culturally relevant ways, it increases the food access for students on campus who might be facing cultural barriers to traditional food that's offered. In addition to our key findings on COVID-19, differential access, and campus agriculture project trends through which Farm to College both improved and worsened student food access and food justice in a variety of ways, the research also suggested how Farm to College could be used as a tool to build the intersectional food movement. So here in this image, you'll see a drawing of all of the different components that can be prioritized by campus agriculture projects and Farm to College with their regional food procurement priorities in how they choose to procure food from different sources. In the research, starting from the literature review and continuing throughout the interviews, we saw how many different kinds of stakeholders were investing in the Farm to College movement and the regional food procurement that it provides. We found that some students, professors, and community members from the education, environmental, local regional food, nutrition, community food security, and food sovereignty movements have joined forces behind Farm to College. In this way, Farm to College represents an intersection of diverse interests and creates an environment for inclusive food activism with a wider range of priorities and a more united power base because of its diversity. Tania can add more about Farm to College as an intersectional movement builder from FIND's point of view.
Sure, Jessica, thanks. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, institutions have a pretty significant buying power even in this pandemic era. But there's multiple ways that they can have influence. There's been a lot of shift away from institutional markets and towards what we call the retail market, so a direct to consumer, because as the institutional markets decreased, producers and distributors had to find markets for their food, and so they were going more direct. There's pros and cons to both approaches. There's economies of scale on both that come into play. But one thing that the institutional market also adds is that when local food or values-based food is procured by that college, they have the opportunity not only to influence what is happening in the food system through their dollars, but also through it's a way to speak to all of those people who are eating at those institutions. It's a way to speak to them about the food choices that they make. So not only is there an opportunity to change and create impact through the choice of the institution, but if that institution is sharing its values, sharing information about the food that it buys with those folks who are eating there, and is encouraging them to also be aware and make good choices when it's up to them at either outside the school environment or in other areas to make those food choices. There's an opportunity to influence what they are doing and understand about this as well. So these sort of multiple layers of potential impact, and we really encourage colleges in particular with the groups that you're working with the students who are going to be major food purchasers going forward. There's just an incredible opportunity to influence the choices that are being made and the understanding of what those choices mean. For an organization like FIND, when we're trying to think about impact, being able to work with an institution to impact both the individual choice level as well as sort of the institutional choice level is a great way to use our limited resources.
I think I'll bring us back to speaker view, and at this point we'd be happy to take questions. I see that a few have already popped up.
Thank you very much, Jessica and Tania, for a very inspiring talk. And also I wanted to send a shout out to Tufts, Tania and Patty Claus, because they have really been amazing at keeping these topics in mind and pioneers in sustainability. and it's always a pleasure to collaborate with them. Okay, so we have a couple of chat questions in the Q&A, but as I said earlier, you can also raise your hand if you prefer to use voice. So why don't we start with the ones on the chat box first? So Leah Lovett has a question, and she says, for farms that don't sell to institutions and listed only one barrier, what barrier did most list?
I think that's a question for me. I believe that in that survey, we allowed producers to select as many of the barriers as they wanted to, as well as write in some. So we were utilizing the number of mentions of that barrier to help identify which were the greatest concern. I don't believe that we offered a ranking on them. I would have to double check that though. But that's actually some interesting food for thought. And so if we're going to reproduce our producer survey, it might be something that we want to think about. So yeah, we were just using percent of producers who identified the barrier to help us identify which were the most significant.
Thank you. The next question. Somebody is wondering about the meaning of locals, because local doesn't necessarily mean organic or any other connotation, just local. So she's wondering whether you think that local food is most sought after because people think local farms are more likely to also have humane, ecological, and socially sustainable practices?
I can take a first stab at answering this question. I think in general, if you're talking about everyone looking for local food, that assumption is out there, and it's something specific called the local trap, where people associate the scale of agriculture with the production methods, the social justice issues on the farm, with the environmental impact, where that might not necessarily be true. I think that in the case of institutions, when they partner with local farmers, most of the time it is a direct partnership with a food hub or a producer that they are using to increase their local and regional food procurement. And so I think most of the time, it is a transparent relationship where institutions are able to see what kinds of practices they are looking for, especially if they're going outside of the normal food system to reach out specifically to local producers. That many of the times I would say that local procurement on campuses might be getting after some of those larger goals that people are going towards when they say local.
Thank you. I have a question. So it was interesting to see how local food can be more expensive and it turns into increased prices in meals, and how that change was only showing when you had when students were buying a la carte meals. Can you think of any things, or maybe you already know besides the examples you mentioned, things to reduce that gap so that regional food doesn't necessarily translate to an increased cost for students that are already facing a financial burden that they cannot access to meal plans?
A lot of universities are already using cost containment measures to be able to purchase regional food within their budgets. And I think that the outlet of increasing costs for students who aren't on meal plans is just another strategy of cost containment. Where can we capture costs to afford this? Where can we cut on costs? So I think that instead of focusing on raising costs for some students, colleges are already participating in a variety of ways to cut costs in other ways, such as bulk purchasing with other institutions in the region. We also heard about some colleges using creative regional food streams to procure food, such as in the New England region, retired dairy cows for meat, which was often said to be the most expensive regional product. So using kind of these cost containment mechanisms that dining services has been very creative at coming up with so far would be a great area to focus on, rather than using the outlet of increasing costs for students.
Thank you.
I'd love to add to that, actually. I know that one thing that Tufts is hoping to do is to bring on more freezer capacity and storage capacity. And that's really huge too, because that allows that bulk buying and that advanced planning, which is also a way, because if farmers have more predictability about what the purchase is going to be, it's easier for them to work around with the price. So by having greater storage capacity, whether that's and being able to process some of these local foods into things that ultimately will be used in campus menus, that's another great way to manage costs, and that's something Tufts is hoping to do. So I hope that that is able to happen. And there's a whole host of different ways. There's some great case studies that FINE has on our website through our resource database that people can look at for more detail on the ways that folks are making local work within cost containment, using cost containment practices.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to mention, I see Patty Claus, the Director of Dining Services at Tufts, is on the line in the audience. So if anybody had questions for her about what Tufts is doing, I think she would be happy to answer them. And I can bring her in if anybody does. There is a question about food waste issues on campus. How does this fit in your equation?
We did ask specifically about food waste as one potential mechanism by which regional food procurement could be related to student food access. And none of the colleges shared that this was something that they were seeing in their experience. One college did share in general that regional food procurement may contribute to higher rates of food processing waste on campus, because regional food products might come in less predictable sizes, quantities, or they might come in their raw form and need to have the ends chopped off and skins peeled, whereas more processed food coming in from different, more traditional food sources would be matched already to the cooking needs of college campuses. So while this response didn't factor in all of the food waste that's already happening before foods get to colleges, at colleges, regional might increase food waste slightly.
And food waste is a huge issue. It's an issue throughout the supply chain, but it's also a major issue sort of within households or on campus, what you choose to eat. So I think individual choice really is important and comes into play, but then also campuses across the board are definitely trying to address food waste. It's on a lot of sustainability efforts, it's one of the first places that companies and institutions will focus, because it's cost saving. If you're wasting less, you're saving money. If you're using more of the food, you're saving money. You don't want to see that go in. It's a really easy argument to make in terms of investments. So you do see that happening. FINE is not doing a lot of work directly on that, but it's something that we do track and pay attention to. And there are maybe some opportunities for us to do a little bit more work on that in the future.
I wanted to add that, since I have it here, about food waste, that Tufts Dining is already doing a great job in reducing that food waste through the Tufts Food Rescue Collaborative. So if students are interested in getting involved with that, Google it, and you will get to the page with all the information. But this is post-consumer waste, so things that are not to end up on students' plates, they are repurposed in other programs. There is another question. Have you looked at whether students feel that local regional food is a priority? Does that differ by race, class, or ethnicity?
I will say that in this research, one of the big gaps was that we did not get to talk to students in an official capacity. I think that we did hear that campus agriculture projects and food movements on college campuses are first and foremost motivated by student interest and activism. That's where most of the change is coming from on college campuses, because it's expensive and it's hard and there's lots of barriers, even if it might be ultimately worth it. The motivation is coming from the student body. I do not have knowledge of what part of the student body is pushing this forward. And one of the recommendations that is coming out of this report on student food access and regional food procurement is to engage more students, and specifically to look to engage the students that are not already chomping at the bit of food movements on campus, to suss out the different kinds of students that are facing barriers in accessing food and may not prioritize local food.
And I'll add that as someone who works with a lot of dining service directors at colleges and other institutions, there is, these are folks who have made food their livelihoods and it's their passion. And there are many people who are bringing a real commitment to local food as well. And they're driving a lot of the innovative work that's happening and making it possible to bring more local food on campus. So I do want to recognize that, but agree that the demand from student body is really essential, because also, even if you have a motivated dining service operator or dining director on campus, if the students aren't demanding it and the administration of the institution is not also making it a priority, it can be very difficult to make inroads there. So there are three sort of important players in all of this, and influencers. I do wish we had a little bit more of the kind of, real data that you're asking for. We have a lot more information that's more anecdotal, case study based. We know that Real Food Challenge works directly with students too, and they have some information available on that. But it also varies because, every year you have turnover in the student body. So there's a lot of difference there. It would be great to have more detail on how to track that over time, though. That's a great question.
Well, thank you so much, both Tania and Jessika. This was really great. And just a reminder, the recording will be available. So come back to check our website and it'll be there in a few days. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. I'm sorry we didn't get to see all your faces, but we appreciate you being here.